Hi everyone, and welcome to another session of Otis for Educators. My name is Emma Foley, and today you're joining us for a course on college and career readiness with your special needs students. I'm also joined here today by Cheryl to help out in the chat box. How are you doing today, Cheryl?
I'm doing great today, Emma. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Remember, if you have any questions at all, just type them in the chat, and we'll be sure to get them answered for you.
Great, thanks, Cheryl. Let's head over to the board and check out our agenda. All right, so taking a look at our agenda here, the first thing we're going to dive into today is just an introduction into college and career readiness. This is obviously a term that's really popular in education now, whether we're looking at our general education population, our special education population, our L population. So we're really going to dive into what exactly that is before I start showing you some example activities that you can do with your students. Now, the next thing we're going to dive into after our introduction is talking about something called the 5 steps for success. So in terms of success, there's definitely some general guidelines that we encourage you to take here at Otis in terms of getting your students ready for whatever follows high school, whether that's going to be the college pathway or maybe it's something in the career field. Now from there, we'll dive into a little bit about growth mindset. That's also another term that's very popular in education now. So what exactly is growth mindset, and how does that impact our special education students? From there, we'll dive into a little bit into assistive technology. We actually have a ton of courses here on our platform about assistive technology, but we'll talk a little bit about how that plays a role in today's course. And as always, the last thing we'll finish off with is some additional Otis content, as well as some resources and what you will find below this course video. All right. So let's dive into that introduction. So here we have just a nice graphic here to show a little bit about, what is college and career readiness? Why are we making this a focus for today's course? And what exactly do you need to do as the special educator in this type of situation? So first thing I mentioned here is this major SEL, social and emotional learning component. So as special educators and as a former special educator myself, this is something that's really sometimes challenging for us, but it's so important in our role. We must debunk our students from that mindset that they're either broken or that they're never going to be good enough. And this is something that I heard all too often when I was in the classroom, and it really broke my heart for a number of reasons. Students need to understand that they are just as capable as their general education peers for taking whatever pathway they choose upon graduating from high school. So when we think about college and career readiness, you may be asking yourself, well, when can this take place? When should I start doing this? I'm an elementary special educator. Should I start now? The real answer is that it can happen as early as 6th grade. And the reason for that is around this time, students start looking beyond their own world. They start thinking about others. They start thinking about what their role in society is going to be. And that really plays into, are they going to take that college pathway, or are they going to seek out a career upon graduating high school? Now, hopefully this course today is going to point out a number of things, but one thing being that there is no one predetermined path that our special education students must take after high school. I know from my own experience, this was something that was really difficult for me to encourage my students to do. A lot of times my students thought, well, this student is doing this, so I must be doing this too, and I can't be different. And that's something that we really need to encourage as special educators, whether you're an elementary teacher or you're a high school teacher. You need to encourage your special education students to be unique. Decide what's appropriate for them, and you're going to help guide them along that way to understand all of the different options available to them, and then decide what is the best that fits into maybe their strengths. And the last thing I mentioned here is that there are a number of different programs and options for our special education students, some including adult education programs, job training programs, life skills programs, and even comprehensive post-secondary transition or CPT programs. Now, if you're thinking, oh my goodness, I've never heard of any of these, I've included resources below for all of these different types of programs. So I definitely encourage you to educate yourself first about these different options and then start talking to your students about them. And some of the resources that I'll explore with you later are really going to help make you a little bit more knowledgeable about these different options, so then you can then turnkey that information to your students. All right, so now what is career and college readiness? And you might hear those two terms interchange, so you may hear college and career readiness, you may hear career and college readiness. Either way, we're talking about the different options available to our students upon graduating high school. So the first thing, that preparation part. So students should be exiting high school prepared for success. Now, that can be a wide range of high-quality post-secondary opportunities. So a lot of those that I mentioned earlier, those CPT programs, those job training programs, that's all of the different options that we're preparing our students to be successful in. Now, when we think about college readiness, and of course we know college is not for everyone, but in the case that we want to start preparing our students for college, we should be preparing them to not only enroll, take place in that enrollment process, but successfully complete entry-level, credit-bearing academic programs. Now, when we get into that college component of today's course, we're going to be talking about two options that are most likely familiar to you already. Maybe you've gone through either one of these yourself, and that's going to be those 2-year post-secondary programs and those 4-year post-secondary programs. Typically, those 2-year, we're referring to those community college settings. And then those 4 years, maybe students transition on for those remaining 2 years to go on to something like a college or university. And that can be public or private, whatever suits that student's needs. Now, the second component of this college and career readiness is going to be the career readiness. So there's 3 major areas that we often speak about when we talk about career readiness. And that's going to involve core academic skills and the ability to apply those skills, employability skills, so things like critical thinking, and we're going to dive into this a little bit more in the later part of this course, and technical job-specific skills. So if you're in the field yourself, you most likely know how big and how important these 3 different things are when it comes to the success in a career. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these. I'm going to share some resources that I've compiled together. But I think after this course, you're going to realize that you're going to start encouraging your students to either take one of these 2 paths. And this is really going to play a big part into how you prepare them. All right, so now let's dive into those 5 steps for success. Now, before we dive into this slide, I do want to mention there's a lot of steps for success. We can't just narrow it down to 5, but these are what I think are the 5 most important steps for you to take as a special educator as you start preparing your students, because this is a very difficult task, and you want to make sure that you're giving students as much knowledge as they need to make a sound decision about what is going to be their next step after graduating high school. So let's dive into those 5 steps. So here I have the 5 steps for success listed out. So the first one being knowing how the brain works. Now, this is sometimes difficult because unfortunately a lot of our students who have disabilities don't actually know the specifics of their disability, and that can be for a number of reasons. We're going to talk a little bit later about the importance of having explicit discussions with your students about their disability. Now, you can always group students together if they share the same diagnosis and kind of talk to them together about, their disability and what things might be impacted by that disability, or you could also do this on an individual basis. But the importance here is about that explicitness. If you don't have those explicit conversations, students are going to continue not having the full amount of knowledge of how their brain works. The next step is going to be to start with strengths. So you want to really highlight those strengths. Everybody has weaknesses, but we're going to focus on those strengths and how those strengths can then push them to success in whatever pathway they choose. The next step would be to learn soft skills. So we'll talk a little bit about what soft skills are, and then you can share that knowledge you have about what exactly soft skills are and plan those activities for students, and that will help them as they make these decisions. The fourth step is going to be explore any of those career and college pathways that are available, and that might be dependent on the area, possibly dependent on the student's access to funds to be able to pay for if they choose that college pathway option. So we'll talk about all those different things, and I'll share some different resources that that are very kid-friendly or young adult-friendly, and you can share those with your students. Now, finally, the last step is going to be making that connection for students. So you want to connect their strengths to those education and career options. So we got a lot of stuff to cover today. There's a lot of information here, but definitely the best thing that you can do as a special educator is to become educated yourself, and then you can make students just that much more prepared as they start making these decisions. So let's dive a little bit into the first step, which is going to be knowing how the brain works. So this is really difficult for some of us because maybe we've never encountered somebody with that specific disability, and we want to teach our students about their disability. So the main thing here is to teach students about how the brain works and how their brain may work differently from one of their classmates or maybe even a sibling. You know, this is something that I've encountered as a special educator myself, is teaching my students that it's okay that their brain might be different from their brother or their sisters, and that just makes them that much more unique, and they need to tap into those specific strengths a little bit differently. You want to teach them to understand that their learning disability is simply a learning difference. So difference, not disability. That's a big mantra in special education, is getting students to realize that they're just different and they may need to make some adjustments along the way. This is something that I mentioned earlier when we started this course, but you want to debunk that idea of being broken. Your special education students are not broken. They simply need to take detours. Detours are okay. That's how we grow as individuals. That's how we get to that point of success, and that might mean that we might need to take several detours along the way. The goal as you are teaching their students about how their brain works is to unlock any motivation and really get them excited about what's to come in their future. So now we'll dive a little bit into the growth mindset. So as I mentioned earlier, this is something that came up in education maybe a few years back, and this is something that, you know, I hear educators talking about all the time, this idea of establishing a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. So there was a psychologist who came up with this thought process, and that's really someone that the special education world really puts on this pedestal, because she really had some great ideas when it comes to, you know, helping our special education students to move from that fixed mindset to a growth mindset. So basically the idea here is that success comes from having the right mindset. So rather than intelligence, talent, education, any of those different factors, success really stems from adopting that right mindset, that growth mindset. So individuals with a fixed mindset, which is typically a lot of our special education students, those are the students that we notice are maybe believe they're born with a certain intelligence, and that intelligence or that level of skill or that collection of abilities, they cannot change. So they believe they're stagnant. They believe that they're always going to be a failure. They believe that they're never going to be good at something. And that's when they typically get frustrated. They give up. They say, you know, they don't want to be challenged any further. They've kind of taken on this mindset that they are who they are and you can't change that. And that's something that really needs to fall on the role of the special educator, is to move those students from that fixed mindset that they're broken, that they're never going to change, and move them to that growth mindset that maybe they're not good at something right now, but they will get better with practice. And I always used to say in my classroom, we're not aiming towards perfection. We're aiming towards improvement, progress. So this is something that's really going to play a role in that career and college readiness as you start developing these different activities, because you want to think about, well, how can I develop an activity that's going to move my students from this fixed mindset that they're no good at something, they're broken, they're never going to be able to do something, to this growth mindset that they're going to be able to do all these little activities along the way, and that's going to make them that much more capable of being successful in a certain role. All right, so the next one is start with strengths. So this is definitely something that we want to encourage our special education students to do, and you do this with all of your students, whether you're a general education teacher, as I mentioned earlier, if you teach students in the ESL population, you want to move them from thinking about all of those deficits to focusing on their strengths. So we don't want to point out all of those weaknesses. We don't want to focus on something that they can't do. We instead want to focus on what they are good at, those strengths. So one question that you could possibly ask your students, and this is definitely something that's even possible to ask your high school students, is how do you know you're smart? Not why are you smart, but how? Tell me something that you can do really well, something that you are capable of teaching someone else. And how might that then contribute to the pathway that you take after high school? So we're going to hop over to the computer now because I want to explore some resources that I've attached to this course video that have to do with multiple intelligence and aptitude surveys. So this is a really great activity for you to do with your special education students because it gets them thinking about all of those strengths rather than focusing on those weaknesses. So let's head over to the computer now and check out some of those resources. All right, so the first one I have here is a career interest inventory. So it says up at the top there, learning about yourself is the most important step in your research for a job or career. A career interest inventory helps you relate your interests and your abilities. That's that key word there, those abilities, because we want them to recognize what they're able to do, those strengths, and then tie those interests and abilities to career choices. So the following survey will help you identify your career interests. So we want students not only to recognize that they're cut out or maybe they'd be better in a certain field, but we also want them to recognize that their interests are what's going to keep them motivated as they enter that post-secondary life. So you'll see here there's a bunch of different categories. We have the realistic, the doers. So students recognizing, checking off, do they like to play sports? Are they good at playing sports? Do they like to care for pets? Do they like to build and construct things? Do they like to do some things around the garden or the lawn, like landscaping? Do they like to work outdoors? So a lot of different things here. It also gets students to think about, well, what kind of individual would they label themselves as? Are they a realistic doer? Are they an investigative thinker? Are they a creator? Do they like art? And there's so many different categories here. And then the final part of this activity has students totaling up. This is also very telling. As students are moving through each of these categories, they might not necessarily recognize on the spot there that, wow, I really am someone who likes being a helper. So they're recognizing here as they total up, okay, this is my top choice here, or this is what most aligns to my personality and my skill set and my interests, and this is maybe something that's at the bottom of the list there. I've attached this resource below the course video. It's free for you to go ahead and download and use as you see fit in your classroom. All right, so let's dive into our other resource we have here, which is going to be that multiple intelligence survey. So as you can see here, you've probably done some of these before yourself. This just kind of breaks down questions, has students rate their interests, so something like I keep or like pets. So again, seeing that similarity there between that taking care of animals as well as caring for others in general. I'm good at or would like to learn foreign languages. So again, students would rate this. I would definitely model this to your students to help them to make sure that they know which one they should be marking. We want to make sure that students aren't just randomly choosing bubbles. So an explicit modeling with an activity like this would be best before you send students off to start working on it themselves. So now we're going to move into the next section of our 5 essential skills here, and that's going to be learning about soft skills. So soft skills are basically the ability to communicate with others, the ability to thrive in the workplace, maybe manage the different tasks that are asked of you, among a host of other personal attributes. So there's a lot that goes into this idea of soft skills. But basically, this is what's going to help our special education students get their foot in the door versus opening future doors. So we're really trying to level that playing field for our special education students and give them that competitive edge. So lessons that are modeled around this idea of building those soft skills, strengthening that ability to communicate, working with others, managing time, that's all really going to help prepare our students for whatever they may choose next. So just to further dive into those soft skills, here you'll see that I've pulled out 5 different soft skills, and there are others that are not mentioned here, but these are the 5 most prominent soft skills that are really going to contribute to a student's success, whether they either enter the workforce or they go that college pathway. Now, an interesting fact, as I was preparing today's materials, I found one particular study that actually said that soft skills actually contribute 75% to the success of an individual in a particular career. So actually only 25% of that success is really reliant on their ability to do all the technical components of their job, but actually 75% of their success is attributed to these 5 soft skills that you see here. So taking a look at the first one here, leadership. Now this shouldn't come as a surprise, but we really need to make sure that we give our students opportunities to take on that leadership role, even if they are predominantly in a special education setting. So one option that I mentioned here is letting students run a community project. So one thing that came to mind is possibly, organizing, if your school organizes something like a homecoming event, where people from the community are going to, attend a day's event where there's a number of different moving components. Maybe you want to consider letting your special education students run a particular part of that. So even if it's something like a raffle, maybe giving them that opportunity to take on that leadership role, and you simply being there as the facilitator, making sure that they're doing, collecting money or handing out the appropriate amount of tickets or something along those lines. Now, if your school doesn't have a homecoming event, I'm sure there's other community projects that occur throughout the year. Think about what components of those projects can you release a little bit of the control as the teacher or the event coordinator. What can you release a little bit of control to your students and let them take that on? Because that's only going to help build their soft skills of leadership and really get them excited about taking on those leadership roles. Now, the second soft skill mentioned here is communication. This is another one that shouldn't come as a surprise because we're constantly trying to think about how we can support our special education students when it comes to communicating. And this can mean communicating with one another. We always design activities to help them establish these relationships with one another and effectively communicate their desires or their wants or their needs, but also communicating with elders. So things like communicating with people of the community, communicating with people maybe via the phone or via email. So one thing I mentioned here as a possible activity that you might want to set up for your high school special education students would be something like setting up a polling program. So a lot of colleges and universities actually have these established polling groups that call, thousands of pullers every single night and take care of, just asking their general opinion about stuff. So why not do something like that, but at the high school level? And you could oversee that, make sure that students are, effectively using the telephone, they're effectively mentioning, what the intention is of that phone call, or maybe they're possibly drafting things to poll via email or whatever the case may be. Maybe people are actually receiving polls via paper. So students are in charge of taking on that activity and making sure that everyone who's intended to receive those polls are, and they're collecting results in a reliable way. Now the next one is teamwork. This is also something that we're constantly doing as special educators. We're thinking about how we can get our students to work with one another. Now, this starts as young as the elementary level. We're constantly, establishing these collaborative groups. But as we start transitioning towards those upper grades, that middle school and high school level, we might want to consider, we have committees as teachers, but why not organize a committee of students? So a lot of times your school will have presidents and vice presidents and secretaries and all those sorts of positions, but you could also create your own committee of students. And this could be a committee that's responsible, similar to that first example, of planning a big school event. So the first thing that comes to mind when we think about older students is maybe giving our special education students a big role in organizing the prom for that year. So lots of different moving parts when it comes to launching a successful event like that. So we want to think about what can we release that control to our special education students, and that's going to help build that teamwork. Now the next one is problem solving. And again, this is something we start at a very young age with our special education students, but maybe we want to start adapting some of those different scenarios for problem-solving situations that our students may run into post-secondary school. So I'm going to hop over to the computer now because I've come up with some example scenarios that you can use with your students to help prepare them for that college and career readiness.
We have some people chatting in the chat box. One such viewer is from a business school, and they complete a vocational inventory on all their students in the classes, and they've been also trying to see if they can coordinate sharing those results with the special ed students too.
Absolutely, Cheryl. That's such a big piece to being maybe at a specialty school like that, where you're helping students of all different all different desires. You want to help share that to all students. It shouldn't be restricted to just your general education population, but our special education students should also be, those materials should be shared with them. I'm going to jump into those scenarios that you might want to present, but also consider that everything we're sharing with you today, whether you're a general education teacher or a special education teacher, a lot of these things will apply to students in both of those settings. So let's head over to the computer and check out that scenarios. All right, so taking a look here, and this is just a few different scenarios that you might want to put together. Obviously, you wouldn't push them out to your students as I have here. This is just a general list for you to start developing different, maybe task cards for your students. So some things that our students may encounter as they graduate high school and they enter either college or careers, they need to maybe solve some sort of, or come up with a solution to a situation like missing public transit. So a lot of our students may not have access to cars, or they may be taking advantage if they're traveling maybe to a school that's not necessarily in their direct neighborhood. They may be taking advantage of different public transportation. So something like missing a public transportation mode on their way to maybe work or even college could present a lot of issues if they don't know how to actively problem solve in that scenario. Also, another one here, not getting along with a coworker. This is another thing that maybe our students need that explicit modeling. And of course, you could do this as role playing in the classroom. But what I would typically do is push out these scenarios, let students work on them individually, and then maybe group students together and let them see different opinions in terms of how to problem solve in these situations. Again, another similar one, running late. We also have left our wallet at home, no money, so things like having to pay for public transportation if they don't have a Metro card or something along those lines. They definitely need to know how to act in that particular situation. Similar to missing that public transportation, a bike has a flat tire if that's their main mode of getting to their job or their classes, their college classes. If their bike has a flat tire, that might be something they need to know how to actively problem solve. This is another one that would affect certain subsets of our students, and that's going to be the abundance of noise that might be taking place in the general area of where they are. So if students are at work and there is a bunch of noisy people, they need to know how to appropriately address that situation. We also have that idea of noisy road work nearby. So that's another thing that could impact our students who have noise sensitivity. So we want to make sure that we coach them through these scenarios. And then finally, the last two on our list, getting lost or losing personal belongings. So a lot of our students may have smartphones and things of that nature now, but we also need to teach them how to effectively use those tools, especially if they get lost on their way to college or their job. So last one we have here on our list of these soft skills is going to be cultural competence. So this is another term that's really big in education now. We want to make sure that our students are prepared to interact with others of different cultures and know how to appropriately interact with them. So the suggestion, it's not something super specific here, but group students from different cultural groups together when possible. So if you're planning different group projects in your classroom, or even if you're just having students kind of talk to a particular prompt that you pose to them, you want to make sure that when the opportunities present themselves, you pair different students from different cultural backgrounds. That's going to help them become a little bit more knowledgeable about other cultures, and that will automatically kind of assist them. There's also tons of activities. I've included some on our resources below this course video. There's tons of activities out there for how you can foster that cultural responsiveness in your classroom. All right, so now the fourth of our 5 essential skills or 5 essential steps. That's going to be to explore those college pathways. So I've touched on this quite a bit already, but the biggest responsibility you have as a high school special education teacher, or even a middle school, high school special education teacher, is going to be knowledgeable. I can't stress this enough that you need to be knowledgeable yourself in order to teach others. So be aware of all the different opportunities that are available to students, and try your very best not to put your own personal opinion in there. We want students to come to those decisions themselves about what's the most appropriate. Of course, with some of our students, we're going to need to provide a little bit more assistance along the way, but when you're knowledgeable, it just makes students that much more capable of making decisions because you share all that knowledge with them. So also I mentioned here, raise the awareness that college is not necessary for every job. So unlike most, mindsets that maybe we had growing up that you need to go to college if you want to get a good job, we want to make sure that our students, especially our special education students, are aware that you don't necessarily need to attend college to be successful in your job. However, if they choose to attend college, as we mentioned earlier, they can go down that 4-year college route or that community college route, which is typically that 2-year option. So definitely being knowledgeable about all the different options available to your students, whether locally or cross-state or even cross-country. Depending on the student, you're going to push out different pathway options. So now, along with that exploring college pathways, you also want to help students to explore career pathways. So this is just a template of a different activity that I included in the resources below this course, and that would be getting students to really note down all the specifics of a career. So say a child or a student is perhaps considering maybe becoming a veterinarian. So they would look into what is the average starting pay, what are the typical work hours. This might be something that's important to know, especially if it's a job that maybe works overnights or possibly longer shifts, something like our healthcare industry. How much training is required? So this is typically getting our students to think about, if college is required, how many years high school? Is it something that they're maybe going to do an apprenticeship? So all that different training really needs to be considered as students are thinking about different career choices. Also, the cost of the training. If it's something that's not available free, if there are fund limitations and maybe students don't have access, can they, pursue scholarships? There's also community funds that are available for students if they want to pursue some training in regards to certain fields. So definitely having all of those resources available for your students is super, super helpful. Also, job outlook for the future. A lot of times our special education students only want to think in the current moment. Is this a field that's a dying field? Is this something that might not be around by the time they're maybe in their 30s or 40s? Is this something that maybe, isn't necessarily, might be deemed not necessarily a need anymore? Is this something that's going to support them throughout their adulthood? Where can this job happen? This is another one that our special education students might not necessarily think about. Is this job that they're considering going to cause them to need to relocate? Maybe they're the type of student that can't be away from their family and needs to be within a certain distance of their family. If they're pursuing something in a rural area but they live in an urban area, then maybe this is something that they might want to reconsider as a choice. And then finally, if they do have to relocate somewhere, do they have plans for living elsewhere? Do they have family members that they can live with? Do they have the means to be able to support moving to another state and having to get an apartment or something along those lines? So let's head over to our computer now and check out some about the career pathways. So some ideas I pointed out earlier about this career inventory. This is a great resource to use as you're teaching about careers. But I've also included this lesson plan down below this course video about career exploration. So taking a look here, I have the procedure laid out, exactly what you would do with your students. All right, so breaking it down into those same categories that we saw earlier in terms of the thinker, the creator, the helper. So a lot of different things. I've also linked that career interest. So I definitely encourage you to check out this lesson plan. This is a full lesson that you can do with your students to get them thinking about careers. And you'll see I have scaffolds in there and other extension activities. All right. So the next part of our course is going to be that final essential step, and that's going to be connecting those strengths to education and career options. So you want to raise student awareness of this idea of a gap year. So this might be something that's unfamiliar to some of you, but the idea of a gap year is basically an opportunity for students to get real-world experience before jumping into more school. So for some of our students, this might be something, maybe they know they want to go to college, but maybe we want to provide them more opportunities to explore the real world before they do so. So once students have identified options that interest them, assist them with exploring available options for support and prepare them to to advocate for themselves. So that brings me to my final piece of today's course, which is assistive technology. So what is assistive technology? Basically, assistive technology is going to be any piece of equipment or a device that can be used to improve the capabilities of people with disabilities. Now, I mentioned some examples here on the side: smart devices, voice amplification systems, screen magnifiers, lifts, ramps, and all of these that you see listed here. Basically, assistive technology is something that follows our students throughout their career or their college pathway. So we want to make sure that our students are prepared and knowledgeable about these things so they can advocate for themselves as they enter those different pathways. All right, so now diving into our additional Otis content. So on our platform here, we actually have an entire micro-credential 13-course series about assistive technology. So if that's something that you think might be worthwhile teaching your students about, again, the first step is going to be to become knowledgeable yourself about assistive technology so you can support your students as they make these different decisions about what their next steps are. I also encourage you to check out our special education category. If you're enjoying this course about college and career readiness, we have a ton of other courses aimed towards all different grade bands in terms of supporting your students and getting them to tap into those strengths and not focus on what they can't do, but instead what they're capable of doing with practice. And finally, I've mentioned a lot about all of the different resources that I've included below this course video. You'll find all of those different resources, that lesson plan, all of those different graphics, the resources in terms of assistive technology, colleges, everything along those lines you're going to find on that Files and Links tab below the course video along the right-hand side. If you don't see it, continue scrolling down on your page and you'll see everything grouped into a folder called Resources. And finally, if you're looking to access the quiz today and you don't see it if you're watching live with us, be sure to refresh your page and you'll see the quiz appear below the chat. If you're watching this archived from the course library, just wait until the end of this video and your quiz should appear below the course video. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this course on college and career readiness for your special needs students. I also want to thank Cheryl for helping out in the chat and all those contributions, as well as Brian behind the camera. Be sure to do the quiz and the survey in order to receive credit for today's course. If you have any additional questions at the end of this course video, you can always click on that Ask Otis button and a member of our team will get them answered for you. From all of us here, have a great rest of the week.